Okay, so that brings us to the first problem of the day, where we need to define a rectangle class. And we actually already given a rectangle class here that has a method for computing the area, so that's good. And then we need to extend it so it also has a method for computing the parameter. And the parameter, remember, is just the sum of all the side lengths. So the parameter of this rectangle, the area of this rectangle will be 6, 2 times 3, and the parameter will be 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 3. So 10, if I did the math correctly, which I hope I did. Okay, so you need to define that. Let's just try to copy paste this rectangle we are given here in and explore that a little bit. So we have the problem here, and I just copy paste the code in because we were given this an example, so we can maybe experiment a little with it. So how does this actually work? Well, if you are completely unfamiliar with this syntax, I'd actually recommend looking at my earlier video, but I'll just give an overview here. So when I type this line, let's try to explore what it does. And I'll do that by inserting some breakpoints. So I'll insert a breakpoint here, and I'll insert a breakpoint up here. Then we'll run it in a debugger. And we see that when I run this in a debugger, it just notices the definition of my rectangle, and then it stops at this line because I have a breakpoint. Now when I press continue, it stops at the next breakpoint it hits, and that's this one. So what is the state of the program now? Well, remember that this special syntax resolves to a function called of the init method. And the way it will work specifically is that this variable first argument self will be, we can just explore that by typing it out here. It'll be an instance of a rectangle object, but it'll be an instance that we haven't done anything to yet. So it's just like what I'd call a naked rectangle object. It's a rectangle object that nobody has affected yet. So that's the first argument of the function, and it's not set down here, right? That's just how Python works. It creates a empty rectangle object or naked rectangle object, and now we have access to that. Width, on the other hand, is 2 because these two arguments are just plunked in here. As in the same order they're given here, they just put in here. So width would be 2 and height would be 3. You can just check that. Width is 2 and height is 3. And then we say self.width equals to 2. And the reason why is width. The reason why I need to do that is because this this naked rectangle object, it doesn't have any attributes. If I try to access the width, it gives me an error. It's not set yet. It only becomes set when I give it a value, like maybe I give it this value. But in this case, we want the rectangle to actually have a width of 2, so therefore we say self.width is equal to width. And now it is indeed 2. And then we do the same thing with the height, and that's what we do down here. And then we end up with a rectangle with the right width and the right height, and that's what the function does. So that's actually just how it works. So down here, if I print rec.width and rec.height, this is going to print out 2 and 3, right? Because that's what they will be set to by this init method. Then we can also call the rec.getArea function. Okay, so what happens when we call that? Let's put in a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here. Now we see when I type debug, we first do this stuff up here, that prints out 2 and 3. Then we get to this line and it stops. Now when I press continue, it runs until the next breakpoint, and the next breakpoint is hit when it calls this function here. Remember what happens behind the scenes. It takes this rect object. If I go to the debug console and explore what value it has, rect will actually be a rectangle instance with this width and height. That's what we confirmed up here. It takes this and it plunks it in as the first input argument to the function. That's sort of what you should imagine happens behind the scene. And that means that the first argument to this function, which we happen to call self, which is the convention, will now be a rectangle object. and it will be exactly this rectangle object. In other words, self will have a width attribute and a height attribute, and it will in fact be a rectangle object. And then we can multiply those together like this, and that gives us 6, and that's what we return. And this is how the getArea function works. And that's why this is going to print out 6 when I run it. So when I run this code, get 6. Now we need to extend that to give it a parameter function. Def get, let's just confirm that by looking at the problem, because I'm not sure what it was supposed to be called. It should be called get parameter. Okay, so that should of course function very similar to the getArea function. Let's just do it explicitly. So we define it as a function on this rectangle object. We give it the first input argument, and these always need to have a first input argument itself, because it needs to have access to the rectangle object. And then we just need to add all the side lengths together. So that means that we add, and I'll just do it in this stupid way, self.width plus self.height, and then we need to go back, and then we need to go up. That just makes sense in my head. And now I can print out red.getParameter like this. And it should still print out 10, and then it calls this function. Now let's just see what it does. We have access to height and width, and that means that when I compute all of this stuff, you can maybe do a little bit of mental calculus, or just type it into Python and confirm that it's 10, and therefore it returns 10 in this instance. We can confirm that by running the code until completion, and it will give us 10. Let's just go to the terminal and run it as a file, just to confirm that's what it does. And if let's say that I remove this line, and I create 2 rectangles, so I create one that's called A, and another one that's called B, and B is maybe a square. Then if I first call these methods on A and call these methods on B, we'll see that in fact A and B maintains their own value of width and height. Let's just confirm that in the debugger. So these will now be separate objects. And it is instantiated like before, so a.width and a.height is exactly the same as before, but b.width and b.height are different, and that's because this line will resolve up to a separate function call of this method, and I'll get a new, I'm automatically going to get a new rectangle instance here, and it's going to be given these 2 variables with the value 5 and 5. And that's why B has its own small internal state. And that means that when I run this line, it does exactly what it did before. I'll just go to the terminal so we can see the output. It does this. Then when I continue until the end of the script, it calls this function, this line, and it gives me 25 and 5. And 25 is of course because it's 5 plus 5, and this is 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. So that's why we get these values. Okay, let me remove these lines to not pollute my script. Go to the debugger and call the test and confirm that it works. Okay, so I hope that got us all started a little bit on rectangles. Now let's move on to the next exercise in the next